After the peak of the franchise that was Terminator 2, each movie afterwards tried something different to recapture the magic. None succeeded, but that didn't stop them from trying. Even though many considered Terminator 3 as a disappointment, the Halcyon group decided they weren't done with the franchise yet, which was sort of obvious given John's line at the end of T3.
The battle has just begun.
Originally, they were going to have Nick Stahl and Claire Danes reprise their roles as John Connor and Kate Brewster, but as they were planning the new trilogy, they decided they needed older actors to replace them as the ideas went further and further away from Judgment Day. Still, they persisted with the idea of having the future war be in its earlier stages. Regardless on your opinion of this movie, this is the first film I'd direct you to if you wanted some nostalgic taste of the year 2009, because this movie very much represents 2009 quite well, in the entertainment industry at least. Christian Bale, who was hot shit because of The Dark Knight, was cast as John Connor, and Sam Worthington was recommended by James Cameron himself after having him in Avatar. As an Australian, I remember the days when Sam Worthington was hot shit in Australia. Everyone was so proud of him for having a ton of breakthrough roles like Avatar, Terminator Salvation, and Call of Duty Black Ops. And now everyone just looks at him as a distant memory. I do hope he'll gain a resurgence as an actor in the Avatar sequels that are coming out, but time will tell. His golden age is long past. Terminator Salvation to date is the only Terminator movie without Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I'm about to say something controversial, but I think Arnold kind of held T2 sequels back. Like, if you think about it, he sorta did. Arnold's T-800 is actually a pretty insignificant character in the series. There are probably a million other Terminators made by Skynet. In fact, there were other T-800s that looked nothing like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was probably incredible luck that the T-800s that were all sent back in time all looked like Arnold. I'm guessing Arnold was the default look for the T-800, and one sent on actual infiltration missions during the future war looked different. Point is, the T-800 is one of countless designs created by Skynet. The big names in Terminator are actually John Connor, Sarah Connor, Kyle Reese, and Skynet, and probably whoever John Connor's top lieutenants ended up being. Point I'm making is, given his actually insignificant role in the universe when you think about it, sequels kind of just had to come up with an excuse to have Arnold in it. Especially when Arnold got older and they had to make excuses for the aging actor. Given the T-800 is relegated to a cameo in this movie, I think they had more time to flesh out the universe and tell a good story. Like, maybe Arnold would deter people from seeing a Terminator movie, and maybe the Genesis and Dark Fate team felt like he was an obligation at that point, but I think it's kind of lucky Arnold didn't have to be in Salvation story-wise, given he was trying to be governor of California. They had to have other actors take his place. Terminator Salvation might not have had Arnold in it, but it had probably the most iconic cast it could have under the circumstances. And given Arnold's character was relegated to a cameo, I believe this movie has the best story post T2. I do think it's a genuinely great story with a few minor issues, but I'll get into that. This trilogy they had was meant to bring in a new era for the franchise. One where they wouldn't let one actor, no matter how iconic, define when a Terminator movie could be greenlit. Of course, this movie didn't make its money back and didn't get its trilogy, but it was a damn good effort. So without further ado, let's get into it. The intro is actually pretty exciting. You'll notice that it isn't the Terminator theme we've all come to know. It's a new theme composed by Danny Elfman, who did Batman 89 and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. I think the new theme is excellent. This theme truly represents how this new planned trilogy was supposed to be a new dawn for the franchise. No longer would we have the obsolete plot of Terminator goes back in time and tries to kill or protect whoever. This shows that they learnt their lesson from Terminator 3. Like, this movie is a sequel to Terminator 3, and adapts to what people criticized about it back when it came out, while still continuing what happened in the movie. The movie begins pre-Judgment Day in 2003. Sam Worthington's character Marcus Wright is incarcerated for a crime involving the deaths of his brother and two cops. Dr. Serena Kogan, asks him to donate his body for research. And I gotta say that the movie start is great. We get immediate character establishment for Marcus. He's a broken man, bitter, and he doesn't think he deserves a chance at life again, or any kind of second chance. He isn't just some asshole for no reason. Through his introduction, we learn who he is right off the bat, while not over-explaining his character, leaving his character vague while establishing his personality. So Marcus is convinced to sell his body off to research by Dr. Kogan in exchange for a strange request: a kiss. I think this further establishes his character with the following line.
So that's what death tastes like.
I don't think this was supposed to be creepy. Marcus is cold as a person at this point. Of course he'd say that, given he doesn't think he deserves a second chance. Of course, the music picks up as Marcus is strapped to a machine and meets what is supposedly his imminent death. He has no last words, which is consistent with what we've seen from his character so far. He doesn't care about life anymore, or death either. And that's the end of the prologue. Pretty cool, right? From what I've heard, most people say this is where the film goes downhill, but I think it has a constant pace throughout the movie that makes it both interesting and exciting. From there, we get some text recapping the end of Terminator 3 and the gap between T3 and this movie. It establishes that John Connor is not in command of the Resistance, although he is decently high ranked in the Resistance. I'll talk about this later. Anyways, John Connor is shown on a mission to get to a Skynet base with his attack force. The atmosphere is really great. What I love about this movie is that it both strongly adheres to the first two movies, yet has its own distinct look. You see, James Cameron himself thought the problem with Terminator Salvation, when it came out in his mind, was that it adhered too strongly to the first two movies, and it didn't do enough to redefine the series, citing how in Terminator 2, he turned the Terminator from the first movie into the good guy. That is an interesting observation, but I have to say, Terminator Salvation, because of Terminator 3, makes the situation quite different to what was described in the first two movies. You see, the Terminator franchise owners at this point could have easily copy-pasted exactly everything we saw in the first two movies and just made it the most predictable thing ever. But they didn't. They took inspirations from the glimpses of the future war that we saw in the first two movies and adapted to what happened in Terminator 3 to make something new yet familiar. I think this was rather clever, because this is a future war movie that is set in an alternate future war, not the future war, meaning that the original future war is still only seen in glimpses in the first two movies. But it still gives us a taste to what we saw in the first two films. John Connor, played by Christian Bale, which was a rather good casting choice. John Connor is meant to be the hero of the future. And who else did Christian Bale play? Yeah, that's right. Batman. I mean, at the time, there probably wasn't a better actor to be John Connor. We see that John has changed a lot since Terminator 3. After his arc in the original trilogy was completed, John Connor vowed to never stop fighting. And he's not close to giving up anytime soon. The future war has given him the willpower to move forward. He and his attack force go down to the depths of the Skynet base. It's here where they find out about the new Terminator, the T-800. And I like the line where one of Connor's troops says, "It's like you said it would be." That line honestly gave me chills, and how appropriate that it did. Someone who I'm guessing is Connor's direct superior orders Connor go topside, given they've got no communication from the troops up there. John Connor goes up, and this one order saves his life, as everyone downside is killed by an explosion, and John Connor, after being attacked by a T-600 that he defeats, reports in and confirms he is the only survivor. Connor walks away from the base, and then we get reintroduced to Marcus Wright, who stumbles out of the Skynet base that John Connor just attacked. And in the steal someone else's clothes trope, he gets his clothes from the remains of a deceased resistance soldier before hiking away from the area. Cut back to John Connor, who jumps into the Resistance Command headquarters, a submarine in the middle of the sea. And it's here where we meet Resistance leader General Ashdown, played by one Michael Ironside, who is part of this iconic Arnold Schwarzenegger moment.
See you at the party, Richter!
Nice connection in the casting. Anyways, I wanted to talk about John Connor not being in full command. This was a great story decision, and is something I completely buy. Not only does it give Connor an additional conflict, given he can't just immediately give everyone orders, but it is also kinda realistic. General Ashdown references how many people see John Connor as the prophesized leader of the Resistance, and reaffirms that he is the leader, not him, and he doesn't believe in prophecies. When you think about it, that actually makes sense. Survivors of Judgment Day would be more likely to trust actual military personnel than some random guy whose only thing in his resume is his role as the Chosen One, which could also just be stupid false hope. Also, given the future war started 14 years ago, which is also why laser weaponry wasn't built yet, humanity is still on the brink and is yet to recover to fighting strength, and given John Connor hasn't gained leadership of the Resistance yet, he can't reform the Resistance to be stronger. Also, to prove that Terminator 3 wasn't pointless, John Connor's lieutenants, aka people who followed him directly, were killed by the TX. The only surviving lieutenant was his wife, Catherine Brewster. You know, on the topic of John Connor's lieutenants, I had a question that pointed out how John Connor's lieutenants in 2004 would have been in the blast zones, so how did they survive Judgment Day? My answer is that given Judgment Day was delayed, it's easy to buy that John Connor's lieutenants would have been in a different location in 1997, when Judgment Day was originally supposed to happen. So there's that plot hole covered up. This film is extremely reactive to what happened in Terminator 3, and shows clear as day that the game has changed. John Connor is not destined to destroy Skynet the way he originally would have. In fact, Skynet could actually win in this timeline, given the predestination paradox is gone given the future was changed in Terminator 2. John Connor and Skynet were heading down into the uncertain future, where both sides would actually need to come up with ideas and strategies to outdo each other. This is what I mean. The future could go any way now, and neither John Connor or Skynet knows where that future is heading. The Resistance Command discusses with John Connor a hidden signal that they can use to control the machines, which they could use to win the war. They are preparing for an attack on Skynet Central in a few days. They're putting all their chips in now. Where we meet Barnes, who is essentially John Connor's sidekick. Barnes was originally written to be a tough guy who would back John Connor up, but the writers decided to give him more of a human edge. Barnes, I think, is an underrated character. You wouldn't get this from watching the movie, but in the external material, Barnes is very religious. He believes Skynet is the Antichrist, and that Judgment Day was humanity's biggest and final challenge. That sorta is true given the religious symbolism in the Terminator franchise, but even in his film-only incarnation, Barnes is a supportive sidekick, and is probably the closest person to John Connor, besides Kate Brewster. Speaking of, I'm glad they didn't just forget about Kate Brewster. Her role is pushed back to that of a supporting character, but given she's pregnant at this point, it's understandable. Both Barnes and Kate Brewster support and back up John Connor in whatever he's in. We also get a callback to the first movie, with him listening to the pre-recorded tapes his mother gave him before she died. They wrote those tapes into the story, and it's actually used in this movie to help guide John Connor in his quiet moments. Meanwhile, Marcus Wright makes it to Los Angeles, and I must say, I think the dual protagonist thing was utilized very well. It gives us two different tastes into the future war. On the one hand, we have John Connor, who's lived in this post-apocalyptic world for years at this point. He's seen it all, done it all, and been there. On the other hand, we have Marcus Wright, where, just like in a Fallout game, he's discovering the new world, and slowly discovering what's become of the world since Judgment Day. The visual world building is great in this movie. We see that Earth has become a desolate wasteland. Eventually, the clueless Marcus, after wandering for a while, comes across a T-600 from the distance. And still unaware of what's going on in the world, Marcus calls out to it, and before the T-600 blasts him into oblivion, a masked teenager pushes him out of the way and saves him from his imminent death. And we see how resourceful this guy is when he traps the Terminator upside down and avert the machine. That's one way to establish this guy's character without dialogue. So basically they destroy the Terminator, and immediately the untrusting teenager then points the gun at Marcus. They mimic the gun snatching scene from Terminator 2, and they use it to have Marcus tell the teenager that if you point a gun at somebody, you better be ready to pull the trigger. The movie is full of references like this, but they're always woven in with the story, and they're not immediately obvious. Most of them anyways. Now, from a story perspective, this scene is great. It establishes two characters and gives Marcus and the audience the information we need. Speaking of, the teenager is the long-lost Kyle Reese from the first movie, and his sidekick Star, who is a mute girl. And I don't see how they could have done any better reintroducing this legacy character. First, I should probably point out the elephant in the room. Kyle Reese in this scene references the opposite of what Kyle Reese said in the first movie, about how moving from Terminators is easier at night. And this movie kinda just forgot about that. And this scene could have easily been done at night, so I have to give the film flack for it. Although I think the filmmakers probably misheard or misremembered what Kyle Reese said in the first movie, because it's reversed in this movie. So I don't think it was like they didn't pay close attention. Second, Anton Yelchin is a great young Kyle Reese. This dude had such a promising career ahead of him, and it's a shame he's no longer with us, but for what it's worth, he certainly did a damn good effort in the 2000s and 2010s. In Terminator Salvation, Kyle Reese is faithfully written and presented from both the writers and the actor. The actor maintains what we knew about the character from the original movie. I can buy that this is the young Kyle Reese, portrayed by someone akin to Michael Biehn. The actor obviously had a respect for the original character, because he did his damnedest to replicate Biehn's mannerisms from the original movie. It's here where we've met most of the main cast, and they did their best to overcompensate for the lack of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And there is a third thing I'd like to talk about, the time travel logic. Now, Terminator Salvation, just like the previous three films, made sure not to make the time travel a confusing, paradoxical loophole in the story. In fact, since Terminator Salvation doesn't have any direct time travel in it, it's a more straightforward movie. Maybe the most straightforward one out of the whole series. Although there is one thing I should address, and that's how Kyle Reese still exists. Logically, given the delayed timeline, Kyle Reese would realistically not exist because the original circumstances of his original birth in 2003 never occurred. Although I don't think it's a contrivance. And it's not just because I'm giving it slack, because it's the same time travel paradoxical question as Marty McFly still existing in Back to the Future after he changed his parents' fates when they met. There are a lot of potential questions posed in Terminator Salvation that are answered by Terminator 3, the previous movie. I think the reason Kyle Reese still exists beyond the fact that the writers wanted to include his legacy character was because his birth was inevitable, just like Judgment Day. Also, I suspect his parents probably met before the original Judgment Day in 1997. Fact of the matter is, it's a time travel paradox question that is easily forgivable because Kyle Reese's presence is absolutely justified. So that's the question covered up. Now, immediately after, Marcus asks Reese where they can find a car, and it cuts to a scene where John Connor are able to use that radio signal thing to control one of the machines. After that, Marcus, Reese, and Star huddle down for the night, and this scene is set up to show that Kyle Reese admires John Connor and the Resistance, and also the impoverished standards he's had to live in, eating coyote meat and stuff. And on John Connor's end, he makes an indirect message to Kyle Reese. That's another thing I liked about Christian Bale as John Connor. I've heard the complaint that John Connor's human side was barely explored, and it was mostly a machine-killing psycho Rambo most of the time. But I don't see that as the case at all, because these speeches that he makes throughout the film is showing him settling down and talking what's on his mind. It's great stuff, and who knew Batman could give a speech? Like, while I suspect John Connor is basically the Batman who uses guns, he is an entirely derivative of the Christopher Nolan movies. In the very next scene, Marcus fixes a car and intends to leave Reese and Star, and references his brother when the radio starts playing music, attracting the attention of a drone. They destroy the drone, and there's a brief moment where we see the drone's perspective and how it has facial recognition on Kyle Reese. Now, I imagine some critic out there would start complaining that Skynet didn't know Kyle Reese's larger role in the victory against itself. And that's where I have to point out the delayed timeline, to prove that these writers adapted to what was in Terminator 3, because Skynet became self-aware in 2004 instead of 1997, they managed to have more information on Sarah Connor, John Connor, and Kyle Reese due to one piece of technology that wasn't there in the original timeline: the internet. Yeah, that's right. Skynet discovered archived articles about the Terminators sent back through time in 1984 and 1995. Kyle Reese said in the original movie that most of the records about Sarah Connor were lost in the war, but the internet's existence in the delayed timeline ensured that Skynet could gather more information on Sarah Connor, Kyle Reese, and John Connor. And you know, that makes for an interesting change, because if the Salvation trilogy was actually made, I'd like to imagine that this would have came full circle. But oh well, we can never have nice things. Meanwhile, on John Connor's end, he is told that there has been a disturbance around LA, and he requests that the two fighter jets in the area check it out. That's when Marcus and crew show up to a seemingly deserted 7-Eleven, where the Slurpees probably dried up a decade ago. It turns out there's a local group of people hiding from the machines, until an enormous Terminator shows up and starts attacking the place. And here comes the coolest action sequence in the movie besides the climax. Basically, the trio quickly realize they need to destroy the Terminator before trying to escape, and they try to do just that. And there's a sequence where these Moto Terminators drive after the trio, but it's all for naught, because Kyle Reese and Star get captured and sent off to robot Auschwitz, and while Marcus does his best to save them, he's knocked off, and on top of that, one of the pilots Connor sent gets killed. The other pilot, Blair, manages to survive. Marcus, after waking up, helps Blair, and she offers Marcus to come back to her base and speak to John Connor. So they hike out, and it's a lot like a post-apocalyptic Lord of the Rings with all the walking now that I think about it. Then we've got a scene of Marcus and Blair encountering survivors, and they are openly hostile. They attack Marcus and Blair, and they both manage to beat them up, and basically sets up the romance between the two characters. This scene establishes a turnaround in Marcus Wright's character arc. Basically, he started off the movie thinking he was as good as dead, and he could contribute nothing to society after his crimes. But here comes Blair, inspiring a spark of hope in him once again. The scene after this, John Connor and Barnes go out to test the radio signal on a larger level, and it's a success. Connor reports this to Command, who tell him the attack on Skynet Central will commence soon. And compassionate Connor, gotta have that on a t-shirt, asks what they will do to extract prisoners from the base. General Ashdown tells him nothing, they die when the attack commences. Connor openly opposes the idea, but he cannot change his superior's mind. So in actuality, I don't have much bad to say about this movie. Even if it's not as good as the first two, it deserves to call itself a Terminator movie at the very least. And then we get some suggestive concentration camp symbolism, as the machines push Kyle Reese and all the other human prisoners off to die, or become slaves, either of which don't sound too good. We see that Kyle Reese's willpower remains strong in this hard time. If I were him, I would have given up all hope. I mean, who wouldn't? Marcus and Blair in the next scene approach Connor's base, and they step through the landmines, but one attaches himself to Marcus and blows up. He's rushed to the sick bay, where they discover something off about Marcus, and Barnes knocks him out. And then the reveal happens. And fuck the idiots who spoiled this back in the trailer before this came out. John Connor and Marcus Wright finally meet each other, and it's not a happy conversation. The first meeting between the two characters happens with hostility. It's revealed here that Marcus is a Terminator human hybrid, and that Skynet presumably replaced all his organs and inner flesh with Terminator parts, although the full details on his transformation aren't so clear yet. Basically, Marcus Wright tries to convince John Connor that he's human, that he was born into the world the same way we all were, and no one believes him, except for Blair. In the following scene, after learning that Marcus will be destroyed, Blair decides to free Marcus and let him escape. And I like this sequence a lot, because it's basically the entire resistance against Marcus. And it's the sort of thing that happens when the good guys oppose each other. Like, from the perspective of Marcus, he isn't a servant of Skynet, but everyone thinks he is. We also have John Connor listening to the tapes his mother left him, and discussing with his wife that he's now conflicted, because now that he's met Marcus, he's unsure on what to do next. Given Blair lied to Barnes that John Connor needed him, John Connor orders a search and destroy of Marcus Wright. Marcus manages to get away, and John Connor decides to personally hunt him down until he and Marcus are at a standoff. Marcus tells Connor that Kyle Reese has been captured by Skynet. John Connor contemplates killing him until he decides to give Marcus a communicator and tells him to deactivate Skynet's defenses so he can roll in and they come to a mutual understanding. And that's what Marcus sets out to do. Then comes one of my favorite scenes in the movie, the start of the climax. John Connor, now that he knows that Kyle Reese is held up in Skynet Central, tries to plead with General Ashdown not to attack Skynet Central. And General Ashdown, not caring that Kyle Reese will be incinerated, ignores Connor and relieves Connor of his rank. He tells the entire resistance not to attack Skynet Central, mentions his mother, and says that she once told everyone the apocalypse was coming. Nobody believed her and locked her away, but now everyone knows what she said was true, and begs everyone over the radio not to attack Skynet Central and postpone their attack. I love this scene. It shows Sarah Connor the posthumous respect she deserves, and is woven in to save Kyle Reese. And we know Connor isn't a shallow arsehole who only cares about preserving his existence because of that earlier scene before he learnt that Skynet had Reese. So after telling his wife that he'll be back, and hijacking a Moto Terminator, he makes it just outside Skynet Central, as Marcus Wright lowers the defenses that John Connor uses to get in. And it's here where all is revealed to Marcus and the audience. Skynet, assuming the role of the Doctor at the start of the movie, tells Marcus that Skynet created him with the purpose to draw out John Connor and finally terminate him after countless failed attempts. I've heard the criticism that this plan and how Skynet executed it was stupid, but I beg to differ. Skynet was obviously not relying on dumb luck, and that Marcus would just happen to draw John Connor out. I think it's pretty obvious when Marcus rips out his control chip that Skynet was also influencing his actions, although Marcus still had some control to not draw suspicion. Meanwhile, on John Connor's end, he frees all the prisoners except Reese, and while trying to find his dad, John comes face to face with none other than the T-800 itself. While the CGI is a bit off, it doesn't look awful at all, and they were trying their hardest. So Marcus triumphantly rips out his chip and aims to defeat Skynet and save John Connor. And this climax is just so awesome. The part where John Connor finally comes to face with Kyle Reese, the father he had never met until now, really gave some payoff to this conversation between John and the T-800 and T2, where Connor acknowledged that he wouldn't meet his father until he was in his 40s or whatever. Oh, and also, General Ashdown's arrogance catches up to him when Skynet tracks his signal and destroys the Resistance command. They have similar shots and imagery during this fight. The T-800 being the direct threat again was refreshing, and especially since they had a completely different context for the fight. It's nice that we're reminded that T-800s were designed to kill, not protect. And the T-800 in this movie is presented as tough and versatile. In fact, it manages to mortally wound Connor by puncturing his chest, and that actually got me, because it seemed like Connor would actually die. But through a group effort, Marcus Wright manages to destroy that metal motherfucker. You are terminated. And this is the most satisfying scene in the movie. Marcus drags John Connor out of there. John Connor is given the button to destroy Skynet Central, and they blow it up. Boom! In the final sequence, after learning that John will not survive, Marcus steps in to sacrifice himself to save Connor. The music and the presentation, everything makes this a beautiful scene to behold. John Connor inducts Kyle Reese into the Resistance, and everyone says their goodbyes to Marcus. He gives a final speech of his own before his death, a speech about what makes us human, and after this, John Connor survives to live another day, announces that the war against the machine rages on, but they will not give up until Skynet is all but destroyed. There is no fate, but what we make. And that was Terminator Salvation. I hope I made the case why this is actually a solid movie in the series, and is most definitely the best post-T2 sequel. Most people just say that it's better than Genesis and Dark Fate, when this movie deserves far more appreciation than that. Even though James Cameron himself didn't think this movie worked when it came out, I didn't think his problem with it being too faithful to the first two films and it didn't do enough to change the formula was actually a problem. Because Terminator Salvation adapts to what people didn't like about Terminator 3 and validates its existence if you weren't completely sold on that specific movie. Don't like jokes? Don't worry, this movie is completely deadpan. Don't like rehashing? This movie abandons the formula that had dried out while adhering to the series' roots. Don't like that T3 looks like an expensive television movie? Not to worry. This film looks like a summer blockbuster. Like seriously, I can say firsthand that the series owners at this point weren't stupid and adapted to what people said, and unlike J.J. Abrams, did not backtrack from T3, but rather embraced it in a positive way that makes you look back at T3 if you didn't like it and say, you know, perhaps I was a little too harsh on you. They could have easily copy-pasted the future war scene in the original two films, but they didn't. They could have fan-serviced the hell out of this movie and milked it to shit, but they didn't. They had creativity and worked with what happened in T3, and made a proper sequel to that film, and in the process, made the original future war a distant vision, while still giving us the future in a different way. Lack of laser guns, more primitive Terminators, and so on and so forth. Kinda just proves that these filmmakers had a vision for the future of the franchise. Originally they planned to kill off John Connor at the end of the movie, but the ending was leaked before the film came out. Unlike the Star Wars sequels, I don't see this as a reckless decision, and that the filmmakers knew it would have been a risky move, unlike JJ and Ryan who didn't care. Looking at the production of Terminator Salvation was interesting, because this was made during the writer's strike and had many hurdles, like when Christian Bale went ballistic on a crew member, which I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on. I suppose he was either having a bad day or he was extremely invested on set and this guy just pissed him off. This film, despite its many faults, manages to be a solid, competent movie while not sharing the level of the first two movies. I wouldn't care if you put it up there. Hopefully I've explained why I think this is a great sequel. Even if you're an OG Terminator purist, I still want to know what happened after Terminator Salvation ended. Apparently there is a comic book continuing the story after the trilogy got cancelled, but come on, I wanted something that was more, well, on screen if you catch my drift. I wanted to see the laser weaponry, the production of the T-1000 prototype, and a payoff for the moment in Terminator 3 when Arnold said he and John would meet again. I guess a comic series is a nice way to make up for the lack of a film sequel and to wrap up the extension story. Like, it might have been better if the movie was more close-ended, and it would have been a great way to conclude the series given Salvation didn't get its sequel. A lot of things came full circle in Salvation, like John Connor finally meeting his father Kyle Reese after never knowing him. I love this movie, and hopefully, if you thought it sucked or was decent at best, I've given you reason to re-watch and re-evaluate the movie. I gave this movie a slightly higher score than T3, maybe an 8.7 or 8.8 out of 10. Now with that being said, my next review in the series will obviously be Genesis. I have some interesting things to say about it. Now, before I wrap up this video, I have to give a very special thanks to my first ever patron. Thank you for donating to the Robert charity. He set the record of being first. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
We found you hiding, we found you lying, choking on the dirt and sand. Your former glories and all your stories, dragged and washed with